Mrs. Elizabeth James visits Mozart. It was a warm spring night in Vienna, 1785, and the air smelled faintly of horse manure, roasted chestnuts, and the sweet promise of inspiration. Inside a modest room lit by a flickering candle, Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart sat at his harpsichord, quill in hand, composing a delicate nocturne for the court of Vienna. His brow was furrowed, fingers moving as if dancing across invisible lines of musical magic. All was serene. All was poised. Until PFFFSSSSHHH. A blast of steam, clanging copper, and the unmistakable smell of burnt suet filled the room. Mozart leapt from his seat, quill flying into a stack of loose sheets, and froze. Hovering in the middle of the room, puffing and sputtering like a haunted teapot, was none other than Mrs. Elizabeth James, ghostly but remarkably solid-looking for a deceased Englishwoman, still wearing her flour-dusted bonnet, her rolling pin tucked under one arm, and her apron mysteriously full of, well, one could only assume, assorted kitchen implements, some of which appeared to have a life of their own. "Wolfgang Amadeus," she bellowed. "Is that you? Or a piano that thinks itself clever?" Mozart, blinking rapidly, whispered. Who are you?" "Who am I?" she thundered. "I am Mrs. Elizabeth James of Notheringgay, ghost, culinary genius, and time-traveling terror of the ages." He blinked again, unsure whether he was dreaming or already dead. Chaos in the night. Mrs. James floated closer, and the harpsichord keys responded as if anticipating a disaster. She poked the music sheets with a flour-dusted finger. What's all this scribbling nonsense? No self-respecting music should exist without the accompaniment of tea, scones, and at least one scandalous pie. Mozart tried to explain that he was composing a nocturne, a delicate, tender piece. Delicate, tender nonsense, Mrs. James declared. "I've composed entire symphonies of disaster in my kitchen, and they were far more musical than this dreary tap-tap-tapping. Where's your passion, man? Where's your custard?" Before Mozart could respond, she whipped out a rolling pin like a conductor's baton, beating the air with such force that the candle flames leapt and the harpsichord emitted a discordant honk, as though in protest. Mozart jumped back. Good heavens! The keys. They are alive. Of course they are, Mrs. James said, peering over the piano. Any instrument can be alive if you batter it properly with enthusiasm, terror, and a little bit of black pepper. At that, she dumped a small bag of mysterious spices onto the keys. Mozart screamed as the harpsichord began to play itself in a frenzy of dissonance. Notes collided, trills exploded, and the music swirled in a storm of flour and improvised percussion. The ghostly lesson. "Listen, Wolfgang," Mrs. James shouted, hopping onto the stool beside him. "A composer who cannot endure a pie in the night is no composer at all. You must write as I cook, with daring, with audacity, and preferably with something on fire at all times." Mozart's quill hovered, trembling. He tried to protest. "But madam, fire is dangerous." "Nonsense," she said, dumping a small, smoldering tart onto the floor. It hissed, steamed, and then promptly rolled under the harpsichord. See? A little chaos inspires genius. Also, a slight risk of singeing your wig keeps the heart alive. The harpsichord rattled, the candle sputtered, and Mozart's cat, fleeing in terror, knocked over a jar of ink, which spilled across the half-written nocturne. Mrs. James peered down and muttered, "Ah, expression. Nothing like inky destruction to bring out the soul. Accidental compositions." Mozart tried to regain control of the keys, but Mrs. James had other ideas. She leapt atop the piano, rolling pin raised like a scepter. Every stomp, tap, and slide of her spectral feet produced a cacophony of sound so chaotic it could not have been humanly planned, yet, remarkably, it sounded oddly inspired. "Ah," she proclaimed, flour puffing like smoke around her, "music is not merely notes on a page. Music is terror, passion, custard, and occasionally the screams of one's cat." Mozart watched, horrified and fascinated, as the ghostly piano symphony unfolded before him. He scribbled feverishly, copying the strange, accidental harmonies, his fingers shaking with a mixture of fear and inspiration. He realized that Mrs. James, in all her spectral absurdity, had accidentally created a new motif, the nocturne of flower and fire. Tea time intervention. Midway through the chaos, Mrs. James pulled from her apron a steaming teapot. "One cannot compose on an empty stomach," she announced, and poured tea directly onto the harpsichord keys. Mozart gasped. "Madam, you." "Silence. This is not destruction. This is seasoning," she said. "Consider it musical infusion. It adds depth, character, and a hint of tragedy." The notes now popped, hissed, and gurgled, producing sounds Mozart had never imagined. He scribbled frantically, realizing that this ghostly culinary mayhem might just surpass anything he had previously composed. Mrs. James clapped her hands. "Bravo! Now, for the piece de resistance, the cake." She opened a small, spectral baking tin, producing a charred, misshapen concoction that smelled vaguely of burnt almonds, vinegar, and ambition. She slammed it onto the piano, sending it wobbling perilously. Mozart could only stare as the cake teetered, threatening to topple, and Mrs. James struck a triumphant pose, rolling pin aloft. "Now, Wolfgang Amadeus, you must not only compose, you must survive the performance." The crescendo. For the next hour, the room became a maelstrom of sound and smell. Candles flickered, sheet music flew, the cat shrieked, and flour dusted everything like powdered snow. Mrs. James conducted the pandemonium with gusto. Each tap of the rolling pin, each hissing teapot, each unexpected tumble of a tart created a new accidental symphony, which Mozart transcribed as best he could. By the end, he was exhausted, exhilarated, and vaguely convinced he had just witnessed a divine visitation. Mrs. James, panting, muttered, "Remember, Wolfgang, music, like a proper pudding, must be daring, loud, slightly dangerous, and occasionally nonsensical." "You're welcome." And if anyone asks, the cat added the minor keys. She winked, stepped back, and returned to her glass and copper kettle with a clatter and a puff of flour. Morning in Vienna. The next morning, Mozart awoke at his desk, quill in hand, surrounded by flour, ink, and the faint smell of scorched custard. The nocturne he had begun the previous night was transformed, wild, unpredictable, and yet astonishingly brilliant. Meanwhile, Mrs. Elizabeth James floated somewhere in time, likely muttering to herself about where she might next appear, perhaps to a young Beethoven or an unsuspecting court in Versailles. Somewhere, she mused, someone needs a proper tea, a rolling pin, and just a touch of chaos.